The first car got booted right around half-time of the neighborhood cookout, and I still remember the sound the owner made when he saw it. It wasn't anger. Not at first, it was confusion. Pure confusion. Like his brain couldn't quite process how the rules he'd spent years defending had somehow turned around and sunk their teeth into him. By the time the sixth vehicle got locked down, people were shouting into their phones. A woman in designer sunglasses was standing beside her SUV, trying not to cry. Someone threatened to call a lawyer, someone else threatened to call the police. And standing in the middle of all of it was our HOA president, looking like a man who had just discovered that authority only works when everybody agrees to play along. The funny thing is, none of it started because of parking. It started because one man fell in love with power. Back then, I lived in a subdivision outside Greenville, South Carolina. Not the kind of place you'd remember driving through, but the kind developers love putting on glossy brochures. Quiet streets, family-friendly atmosphere, beautiful community living. Translation: 47 nearly identical houses, matching mailboxes, decorative trees nobody cared about, and an HOA that treated every minor inconvenience like a national emergency. I'd moved there after a rough divorce. My ex-wife got the house in Columbia. I got a decent settlement, a pickup truck, and a strong desire to spend the rest of my life not arguing about backsplash tile colors. For a while, the neighborhood was exactly what I needed. My next-door neighbor, Carol Whitmore, baked blueberry muffins every Sunday morning, and somehow always had extras. Across the street lived a retired Marine named Frank Delaney, who spent most afternoons sitting on his porch judging everybody's lawn while pretending he wasn't judging everybody's lawn. Kids rode bicycles through the cul-de-sac. People waved. Dogs barked. Life was pleasantly boring. And honestly, I liked it that way. The HOA barely existed. Every now and then, we'd get an email reminding people not to leave trash cans visible from the road overnight, but that was about it. Then, Grant Holloway got elected HOA president. Before that, Grant was just another middle-aged guy. Khaki shorts, weekend grilling, college football obsession, the kind of man you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. Then he got elected, and something changed. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that within 2 months he was carrying a clipboard around the neighborhood. An actual clipboard. Every evening around 6 o'clock he'd walk the streets taking notes like he was conducting some kind of suburban military inspection. At first people laughed about it. Frank called him the mayor. Carol called him Captain Compliance. Everybody joked, until the fines started showing up. $50 for visible trash bins, $75 for holiday decorations left up too long. One family got cited because their basketball hoop wasn't stored according to HOA guidelines. The violations kept coming. And every single time somebody complained, Grant gave the exact same speech. If rules don't apply equally, they don't mean anything. At first that sounded reasonable. The problem was, he only seemed interested in equality when ordinary residents made mistakes. Parking became his favorite weapon. According to HOA regulations, no vehicle could remain parked along neighborhood curbs longer than 30 minutes unless it was inside a designated guest area. 30 minutes. That was it. Didn't matter if someone was unloading furniture, didn't matter if relatives were visiting, didn't matter if it was Christmas. 30 minutes. One evening, my younger sister Madison drove up from Atlanta to visit. She parked outside my townhouse because my driveway was full and came inside carrying enough food to feed an army. We were maybe halfway through dinner when somebody knocked on the door. I opened it and immediately knew who it was. Grant stood there smiling, holding a violation notice. I looked down. $150 fine. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because it felt ridiculous. "You're serious?" I asked. "Rules are rules, Ethan." Madison stepped into the hallway behind me. "Wait," she said. "You're fining me for parking outside during dinner?" Grant shrugged. If exceptions are made for one person, everyone expects special treatment. There are moments when people tell you exactly who they are. Most of us just don't recognize it until later. That was one of those moments. After he left, Madison stared at the closed door for a few seconds. Then she said, "Your HOA president acts like a substitute teacher who got bullied in high school." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my plate. The problem was, the joke stopped being funny after a while, because it wasn't just me. Carol got fined when her daughter parked slightly over a curb line while helping her husband recover from surgery. A family down the street got cited because a furniture delivery truck stayed too long during an installation. Even contractors started complaining. The fines kept getting larger. The warnings kept getting more aggressive. And Grant seemed to enjoy every second of it. What bothered me most wasn't the money. It was the humiliation, the way he'd show up personally, the way he'd hand people violation notices with that calm little smile, the way he always acted like he was teaching everyone a lesson. Then I noticed something strange. Every 3 months, the HOA hosted social gatherings at the community clubhouse. Wine, barbecue, cheap live music, the usual neighborhood stuff, and every single event created the exact parking situation Grant claimed to hate. Cars lined both sides of the curb. Vehicles sat there for hours. Nobody got fined. Nobody got cited. Nobody got photographed. Most interesting of all, Grant's black Mercedes was always parked right there with everybody else's. The first time I noticed it, I ignored it. The second time, I got curious. By the third event, I started paying attention. See, before real estate consulting, before marriage, before any of that, I'd spent nearly a decade working municipal code enforcement. Most people think code enforcement is about writing tickets. It isn't. It's about paperwork, jurisdiction, property boundaries, tiny details buried in documents nobody reads. Power comes from those details, and something about Grant's confidence started bothering me. Because people who actually understand authority usually don't throw it around. The loudest people are often the ones who understand it the least. During the next HOA mixer, while everybody else drank wine under string lights behind the clubhouse, I sat on my porch with a notebook. I wrote down vehicle locations, arrival times, license plate numbers, nothing illegal, just observations. Then I went inside and started digging through county property records. At first, I wasn't looking for revenge. Honestly, I was looking for an explanation. Something didn't add up. And about 2 hours later, I found it. A tiny notation buried inside an original subdivision survey filed decades earlier. One line, one insignificant-looking line that most people would never notice. I leaned closer to the screen, read it again, then a third time, and suddenly my heartbeat picked up. Because according to the survey, the curb running along the eastern side of my property wasn't HOA-owned common space. It never had been. I sat there staring at the document for nearly 20 minutes, waiting for the catch. There is always a catch, but the more records I checked, the clearer it became. The HOA didn't control that stretch of curb. The county records showed it belonged to the lot owner, and the lot owner was me. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I had a plan yet, not because I wanted revenge, but because for the first time in years, Grant Holloway had made a mistake, and unlike every resident he'd ever find, I actually knew how to use paperwork. What I didn't know yet was just how far that discovery was about to take things, and looking back now, that little survey line may have been the most expensive mistake Grant ever made. The next morning, I convinced myself I was probably overreacting. That's what reasonable people do, right? You find something interesting, you sleep on it, then you wake up and realize it doesn't actually matter. Except I woke up thinking about that survey line. I made coffee. Still thinking about it. Took a shower. Still thinking about it. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in my truck driving toward the county assessor's office because I needed somebody else to tell me I was wrong. The woman behind the counter was named Linda, late 60s, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. The kind of county employee who looked like she'd seen every possible form of human stupidity and wasn't surprised by any of it anymore. I handed her the documents. She looked through them quietly. Then she nodded. Yup. Just one word. Yep. I waited. She looked up. Something wrong? I was expecting more explanation than that. She smiled. Nope. That's your property. She tapped the map. This entire strip. What about the HOA? What about them? Do they have authority over it? She looked at me for a moment and gave me a look that basically translated to bless your heart. They have authority over HOA property. She tapped the survey again. This isn't HOA property. I remember walking back to my truck feeling strangely calm. Not excited, not angry, just calm. Because for the first time in years I had proof that Grant's authority wasn't nearly as absolute as he'd convinced everyone it was. Now here's where people usually assume I immediately started plotting revenge. Truth is, I didn't. At least not right away. For about a week I sat on the information. I went to work, mowed my lawn, helped Frank replace part of his fence. Life went on. But once you see hypocrisy, it's hard to stop seeing it. Every time Grant handed out another violation notice, I thought about that curb. Every time he lectured somebody about fairness, I thought about that curb. Every time his Mercedes sat outside the clubhouse for hours during HOA events, I thought about that curb. Then something happened that finally pushed me over the edge. Carol's husband suffered complications after his surgery. Nothing life-threatening, thankfully, but enough that he needed frequent visits from a home health nurse. One afternoon, I watched the nurse arrive. She parked along the curb, went inside. 40 minutes later, Grant showed up, clipboard in hand, like always. I was standing in my garage when I saw him place a warning notice beneath the nurse's windshield wiper. The woman was literally helping an elderly man recover from surgery, and Grant still couldn't leave it alone. That was the moment something inside me snapped, not explosively, quietly, the way a rope finally breaks after being pulled tight for too long. That evening I started making phone calls. Careful phone calls. Boring phone calls. The kind that would put most people to sleep. I contacted the city regarding vehicle immobilization regulations, then county permitting offices, then a private enforcement company. Every conversation basically came down to one question. If a private property owner follows every requirement exactly, can unauthorized vehicles be legally immobilized? The answer surprised even me. Yes, absolutely, but only if everything was done correctly. The permits, the signs, the documentation, the fee disclosures, every detail had to be perfect, which was fine by me. Details were my specialty. A week later, I filed the paperwork. 2 weeks after that, I received approval. Then came the signs, bright, reflective signs, impossible to miss. UNA to Hara ZV subject to immobilization, removal fee, $250, authorized private property. I installed 3 of them along the curb. Frank nearly dropped his coffee when he saw them. Oh my God. What? You actually did it? Did what? He stared at me. Ethan, I've known you 4 years. So? I know that face. What face? The face people make right before they launch a missile. I laughed. But honestly, he wasn't entirely wrong. The signs immediately became neighborhood gossip. People slowed down while driving past. Dog walkers stopped to stare. A few residents came over asking questions. I answered honestly. Private property. Private enforcement rights. Fully permitted. Nothing complicated. Grant noticed them the same day. Of course he did. A man like Grant noticed everything. 3 evenings later, he walked over while I was trimming hedges. He tried to sound casual. Failed completely. Interesting signs. I shrugged. Thanks. Expecting parking issues? Maybe. His smile tightened. You know HOA parking policies still apply throughout the neighborhood. I looked up from the hedge trimmer. No, they don't. His expression changed, only slightly. But I saw it, the first crack. The community rules apply everywhere. They apply on HOA property. This is OA property. No. I smiled. It isn't. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I could practically see calculations happening behind his eyes. Finally, he crossed his arms. I'll have legal review this. Please do. That ended the conversation. But it definitely didn't end his curiosity. Over the next few days, I caught him examining survey markers, taking photos, walking the property line, trying very hard not to look concerned. Then the HOA sent me a violation notice. I wish I were kidding. Apparently, my warning signs were considered visually disruptive. Community aesthetics. That was the official complaint. I laughed so hard I almost framed the letter right then. Instead, I waited until the following week, when a second notice arrived, and then a third. By that point, I actually did frame one. It's probably still hanging somewhere in storage. The funniest part? None of the notices actually ordered me to remove the signs, because their attorney had apparently informed them they couldn't. So instead, they just complained repeatedly and hoped I'd get tired of looking at them. I didn't. October arrived. The annual Fall Harvest Social was approaching. And if you've never attended a suburban HOA social event, count yourself lucky. Picture mediocre barbecue, folding chairs, local musicians covering old country songs, and 40 adults pretending they're having fun because their dues help pay for it. Grant loved those events. Loved them. He'd walk around shaking hands like a mayor campaigning for re-election. People smiled. People nodded. Most of them couldn't stand him, but nobody wanted to become his next target. Fear has a way of creating fake politeness. By then, I'd started noticing something else. People were talking more openly. Quiet conversations, whispers after meetings, complaints shared in driveways. The resentment had been building for years. I wasn't the only person who saw it. Grant just happened to be the last one to notice. A few weeks before the social event, I ran into Carol while checking my mailbox. She glanced toward the clubhouse, then back at me. "You know, everybody thinks something's coming." "What do you mean?" She smiled. "Nobody puts up signs like that for no reason." I laughed. "Maybe I just like signs." "No." She shook her head. "You're waiting." The funny thing was, she was right. I was waiting. Not for revenge. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I was waiting for consistency, waiting for the same people who preached rules to finally live under them, waiting to see whether they truly believed everything they'd spent years forcing onto everyone else. The Fall Harvest Social arrived on a bright Sunday afternoon. Perfect weather, blue sky, cool breeze, the kind of day that makes real estate agents sound like poets. Around noon, the first vehicles arrived, then more. I sat on my front porch drinking iced tea, watching, waiting. An SUV parked along the curb, then a luxury sedan, then a pickup truck. By 1 o'clock, the entire stretch beside my property was filling up exactly the way it always did during HOA events, one by one, space by space. The signs stood right there, large, reflective, impossible to miss. Nobody even looked at them. That told me everything I needed to know. Rules are easy to ignore when you've spent years believing they only apply to other people. Around 1:30, Frank wandered over carrying a folding chair. Without saying a word, he set it beside mine. Then he sat down. I looked at him. He looked at me. "You're really doing this?" I took a sip of tea. "Doing what, Ethan? What? Stop pretending." I smiled. For the next hour, we sat there watching the event unfold. More cars arrived. Families headed toward the clubhouse. Children ran across the grass. Music drifted through the air. And eventually, exactly 7 vehicles ended up parked along my curb, including Grant Holloway's black Mercedes. Right beneath the warning signs, Frank stared at it, then looked at me, then looked back at the Mercedes. A slow grin spread across his face. "Oh!" I glanced toward the clubhouse where Grant was laughing with residents and shaking hands. Completely unaware, Frank leaned back in his chair. "Oh, this is going to be spectacular." I checked my watch. Then I reached for my phone. Because after 6 weeks of preparation, after years of watching people get humiliated, after every warning, every fine, every lecture about fairness, the moment had finally arrived. And once I made that call, there would be no turning back. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant when I made that call. I didn't. Honestly, the feeling was closer to acceptance, like a train had already left the station weeks earlier, and all I was doing now was watching it arrive at its destination. The enforcement company showed up about 25 minutes later. Plain white truck. No flashy logos, no drama, just 2 guys in reflective vests carrying clipboards and equipment. Professional, efficient, completely uninterested in neighborhood politics. I met them at the curb, showed them the permit, showed them the property records, showed them the authorization paperwork. One of the technicians glanced through everything, nodded once, "Looks good," and then they got to work. Clank, clink, clink, one vehicle after another. No speeches, no arguments, no hesitation, just procedure. Frank was sitting beside me trying so hard not to laugh that his face had turned red. About 15 minutes later, the first owner noticed. A man wearing a golf shirt walked down to the clubhouse carrying a plate of barbecue. Halfway to his vehicle, he stopped, completely froze. "What the hell is that?" The entire parking lot seemed to pause. People looked up, turned around, started walking toward the curb. Within minutes, confusion spread through the crowd like a brush fire. Someone was demanding answers. Someone else was taking photos. A woman was already on her phone. Then came the shouting, and right on schedule. Grant appeared. The look on his face is something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Not because he was angry, not immediately. First came confusion, then disbelief, then panic. The realization unfolded right there in front of everyone, layer by layer, like watching somebody discover the floor beneath them wasn't actually solid. He marched across the grass toward me, fast, jaw clenched, phone already in his hand. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I stood up slowly, enforcing parking regulations. His face immediately darkened. "This is HOA property." I handed him a copy of the survey. "No," I said calmly. "It isn't." He looked down, read the document, looked at the curb, looked at the signs, looked back at me. For a few seconds, he genuinely seemed unable to process what he was seeing. Then the anger arrived, full force. "You planned this." "Of course I planned this." The honesty caught him off guard. "You deliberately targeted board members." I shrugged. "I enforced the rules equally." A few nearby residents exchanged looks. Someone actually laughed. Grant turned toward them, then back toward me. His ears were turning red. "You think this is funny?" "No," I said. "I think it's familiar." That landed exactly the way I intended, because everybody standing there understood what I meant. For years, residents had stood in that exact spot, listening to him explain why rules mattered more than circumstances. Now the roles had reversed, and suddenly circumstances mattered very much. The complaints started pouring in. One owner argued about the fee, another demanded immediate removal, a third threatened legal action. The technicians didn't react. They'd heard it all before. One of them simply pointed at the sign. The same sign everyone had ignored. Then Grant called the city. I knew he would. Honestly, I was counting on it. About 30 minutes later, a municipal compliance officer arrived. His name was Kevin. I'd met him years earlier during my code enforcement days. The moment he stepped out of his vehicle, I knew how this was going to end. Grant practically sprinted toward him. This homeowner illegally immobilized multiple vehicles during a community event. Kevin listened patiently. Then he reviewed the documents. The permit, the property records, the signage, the authorization paperwork. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. Finally, he looked up. "Everything appears compliant." Silence. Not complete silence. People were still talking. Cars were still passing. Music from the clubhouse was still drifting through the air. But emotionally, silence, the kind that follows a verdict. Grant stared at him. "What?" Kevin remained calm. "The property owner followed all applicable requirements. But this is an HOA community. That doesn't change property ownership." Grant blinked. Kevin continued. "The HOA governs HOA property." Then he pointed toward the curb. "This is not HOA property." There it was. The sentence that shattered everything, because for years Grant had acted as though authority came from confidence. But authority doesn't come from confidence. It comes from limits, from boundaries, from jurisdiction, and he had spent years pretending those limits didn't exist. One by one, residents started paying the release fees. Nobody was happy about it, but nobody had much choice. Every payment felt like another crack appearing in the image Grant had built for himself. The image of the man who always knew the rules, the man who always had control, the man who always won. At one point, I watched him step away from the crowd and call his attorney. He wasn't exactly quiet. Everyone heard parts of the conversation. No, they booted all of them. Pause. "Yes, I checked the signs." Pause. "What do you mean, valid jurisdiction?" Longer pause. His shoulders dropped. And in that moment, I already knew what the attorney was telling him. "You can't win this." The event never recovered. People stopped caring about the barbecue. The musician packed up early. Families started leaving. Conversations shifted away from food and towards something far more interesting. Grant. For the first time in years, nobody was afraid of him. That turned out to be the real consequence. Not the boots, not the fees, not the embarrassment. Fear disappeared. And once fear disappears, people start asking questions. The weeks that followed were absolute chaos. Neighborhood social media groups exploded. Residents argue, non-stop. Some thought I'd gone too far. Others treated me like some kind of folk hero. Frank printed a post that called me the parking vigilante and taped it to my mailbox. I wish I were joking. But beneath all the jokes and arguments, something important had changed. People started speaking up. Openly. At meetings, in emails, in public. Questions started appearing. Questions nobody had dared ask before. Why were certain residents receiving exceptions? Why were some violations ignored? Why were landscaping costs increasing every year? Why were financial reports becoming harder to access? The board struggled to answer. Then residents requested an independent audit. Grant fought it aggressively. Too aggressively. That's usually a bad sign. A month later, rumors started circulating. Vendor contracts connected to relatives, questionable spending decisions. Selective enforcement, nothing dramatic enough for a television crime show, just the kind of small corruption that grows quietly when nobody thinks accountability matters. Then came the surprise. 1 week before auditors arrived, Grant resigned. No emotional speech, no public explanation, just an email. 3 paragraphs. Polite, professional, completely empty. I read it twice. Expected satisfaction. Expected victory. Instead, I mostly felt tired, because revenge is strange. People imagine it feels like fireworks. Usually it feels like silence, like finally setting down something heavy you've carried for too long. The truly funny part happened a few weeks later. During a routine HOA revision meeting, the 30-minute parking restriction quietly disappeared from the bylaws. No announcement, no discussion, no justification. Gone. Just like that. The rule Grant had defended for years vanished overnight, almost like it had never mattered at all. A few days before Christmas, I ran into him one last time. Grocery store, frozen food aisle, of all places. He looked different. Smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally, like life had finally reminded him he wasn't the king of anything, just another guy buying dinner. For a moment I considered walking past him. Then he spoke. "You embarrassed me." His voice wasn't angry, just tired. I leaned against my shopping cart. "You embarrassed a lot of people." His jaw tightened. I was trying to protect the community. For a second I almost believed he meant it, because maybe part of him really did. Maybe that was the tragedy. Most people don't become villains overnight. They convince themselves they're helping. Then they become so attached to authority they stop noticing what they're turning into. "No," I said quietly. "You were trying to control it." That hit harder than anything else. I could see it, the recognition, the part of him that already knew. We stood there awkwardly among frozen pizzas and ice cream for several seconds. Then he asked the question, the one question that had probably been bothering him since the day of the booting. Was it worth it? I thought about that. Longer than he expected, because honestly, I still wasn't sure. Maybe I'd gone too far. Maybe I hadn't gone far enough. Maybe both things could be true. Finally, I answered, "I think people should be careful creating rules they wouldn't want to live under themselves." Then I grabbed my groceries and walked away. And that's where the story should probably end. Except even now, years later, people still argue about it. Some neighbors think I stood up to a bully. Others think I became one. Some believe I defended fairness. Others think I weaponized technicalities for revenge. Maybe everybody is a little right. Maybe that's why the story refuses to die. Because deep down it was never really about parking spaces. It was about dignity. About power. About what happens when the people enforcing rules stop believing those rules apply to them. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have done the same thing? Did Grant get exactly what he deserved? Or did I become just another version of the person I claimed to be fighting? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and trust me, this story starts arguments every time it's told. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's dealt with a power-hungry HOA. Because sometimes the most interesting battles aren't fought over money or property. They're fought over something much simpler: respect,